Late on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the quiet halls of the community ballet studio were buzzing with anticipation. Little feet shuffled in rhythm on the polished wooden floors, and excited whispers filled the air as parents peeked through the small glass windows on the studio doors. It was a day like any other for 10-year-old Mia, a bright and determined young girl who had dreamed of becoming a ballerina ever since she could remember. Mia had worked hard to earn her place in this ballet class. She had poured hours into perfecting her pirouettes and plays, her natural talent shining through with every graceful move. But today, something was different. Something felt off. Mia's father, Jordan, sat in the waiting area, tapping his foot nervously. As a single father, he prided himself on being there for every recital, every practice, and every milestone in Mia's journey. He knew how much ballet meant to her, and her excitement always gave him the strength to push through long days at work. But lately, Jordan had noticed subtle changes in Mia. Her once bubbly chatter about class had become more guarded, her bright smile dimming when ballet was mentioned. He chalked it up to the pressures of performance, or perhaps the natural ups and downs of growing up. After all, she was still a child finding her way in a demanding art form. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Inside the studio, Mia stood in line with the other girls, her posture perfectly straight, her movements precise. But her heart was racing, and she could barely focus on the instructor's commands. Mr. Whittaker, the revered and respected ballet instructor, was a figure of authority in the world of dance. With his silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and a reputation for shaping future stars, he commanded the respect of students and parents alike. Yet, behind the polished exterior and the applause of recitals, there were moments Mia wished she could forget. Moments that made her question her place in the studio and whether her love for ballet was worth the fear and unease she felt in his presence. Mia didn't know how to tell her father. How could she? She worried he wouldn't believe her, or worse, that he'd pull her out of ballet altogether. But today, as she felt Mr. Whittaker's gaze linger a little too long, as his words dripped with condescension and veiled threats, Mia made a decision. She had to speak up. She couldn't carry the weight of her silence anymore. After class, Mia hesitated in the dressing room, her friends laughing and chatting as they packed their bags. She waited until the room emptied, mustering the courage to face her dad. Jordan was waiting for her in the lobby, his warm smile greeting her as always. But before he could ask about class, Mia blurted out, "Dad, I need to tell you something. It's about Mr. Whittaker." The words tumbled out before she could second-guess herself. Jordan's expression shifted from confusion to concern as he listened intently. Mia's voice shook as she recounted the uncomfortable encounters, the inappropriate comments, and the moments that had made her feel small and powerless. She told him about the times she had tried to brush it off, convincing herself she was imagining things, only for the feelings of discomfort to return tenfold. Jordan's face hardened as he listened. His protective instincts kicked in, and he fought to remain calm for Mia's sake. "You did the right thing by telling me," he said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained anger. "I'm so proud of you for speaking up. We're going to handle this together." The drive home was silent, but Jordan's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He knew he couldn't let this slide. Mia's safety and well-being were his top priorities, and he was determined to get to the bottom of this. The next day, he called the studio's management, demanding a meeting. But the response he received was far from what he had expected. The studio seemed more concerned about protecting Mr. Whittaker's reputation than addressing Mia's claims. They dismissed her as misinterpreting his behavior, suggesting she might be overly sensitive or mistaken. Jordan was livid. How could they downplay something so serious? He knew Mia wasn't mistaken, and he wasn't about to let anyone invalidate her experience. That evening, he sat down with her again, explaining that this might be a long and challenging fight, but he was ready to stand by her side every step of the way. Word began to spread among the parents, whispers filling the hallways of the studio. Some were quick to defend Mr. Whittaker, citing his decades of teaching and spotless record. Others weren't so sure, recalling moments they had dismissed as harmless, but now seemed to carry a darker undertone. The tension in the studio was palpable, and Jordan knew it was time to take things to the next level. He sought legal advice, determined to hold the studio and Mr. Woodtaker accountable. The attorney he consulted encouraged him to document everything, every detail Mia shared, every interaction with the studio's management, and every piece of evidence they could gather. It wasn't just about Mia anymore. It was about ensuring no other child would have to endure what she had experienced. As the case gained momentum, more families came forward with stories that mirrored Mia's. Parents who had once trusted Mr. Whitaker with their children now questioned whether they had missed the warning signs. The once revered instructor found himself under increasing scrutiny, his carefully crafted image beginning to crack. But even as the truth began to surface, the road ahead was fraught with challenges. The legal system was slow, and the studio's powerful connections made it clear they weren't going down without a fight. Jordan and Mia found themselves facing backlash, with some accusing them of trying to destroy a man's career over what they deemed misunderstandings. The weight of the fight was heavy, but their resolve remained unshaken. As the first court date approached, Mia's courage became the center of attention. She was no longer just a young girl pursuing her dreams. She was a voice for countless others who had been silenced. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Jordan and Mia prepared to take the stand, ready to share their story and expose the truth. But just as they thought they were ready, an unexpected revelation threatened to upend everything they had worked for. A new twist in the case left them questioning who they could trust and whether justice would truly prevail. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight was far from over. Jordan couldn't sleep that night. He sat in the dimly lit living room, staring out the window as the rain softly pattered against the glass. His mind replayed Mia's trembling voice, the details she shared, and the way she had clung to him afterward, as though she was afraid to let go. How had this happened without him noticing? He prided himself on being a hands-on dad, always attuned to her needs. Yet, somewhere along the way, she had been carrying this burden all on her own. That thought gnawed at him, filling him with a sense of guilt and a growing resolve to make things right. The next morning, Jordan dropped Mia off at school, his eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of Mr. Woodtaker's car. He wasn't sure what he would do if he saw the man. Confronting him directly wasn't the answer, at least not yet. Jordan knew he needed to play this smart. As he pulled out of the school parking lot, he decided to make another call to the studio. The first time, they had brushed him off, but he wasn't about to let them ignore him now. He wanted answers. More importantly, he wanted action. The phone rang several times before a calm, almost rehearsed voice greeted him. It was the studio manager, a woman named Karen who Jordan had met a handful of times during recitals. She was polite but distant, her words carefully chosen as she explained that the studio was looking into his concerns. Jordan could tell she was trying to pacify him, to make this whole situation disappear without causing waves. But Jordan wasn't having it. He pressed her, asking what looking into it actually meant. Would they be speaking to other students? Other parents? What steps were they taking to ensure the safety of the children in the meantime? Karen's tone shifted slightly, growing more defensive. She assured him that the studio took all claims seriously, but emphasized that Mr. Whitaker had been with them for years and had never faced accusations like this before. Her words stung, as though she were implying Mia's account was somehow less credible because it was the first of its kind. Jordan clenched his jaw, holding back his frustration. He thanked her for her time and hung up, his determination only growing stronger. Later that evening, Jordan sat down with Mia again. He wanted to make sure she was okay, that she didn't feel overwhelmed by everything happening. She was curled up on the couch, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, a habit she hadn't indulged in for years. It broke Jordan's heart to see her like this, so vulnerable and uncertain. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked gently, sitting beside her. Mia shrugged, her eyes fixed on the TV, but clearly not paying attention to whatever show was playing. "I don't know, she admitted after a moment. I don't want to go back there. Not while he's still there. Jordan nodded, understanding completely. You don't have to, Mia. You're not going back until we figure this out. I promise you that. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Thank you, Daddy, she whispered. In that moment, Jordan knew he was doing the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be. He would protect her, no matter what it took. The next day, Jordan decided to speak to some of the other parents. He started with Stephanie, a mother he had known for years. Her daughter, Lily, had been in Mia's class since they were both 5 years old. Stephanie was shocked when Jordan told her what Mia had shared. At first, she was hesitant to believe it. Are you sure? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. I mean, Mr. Woodtaker has always been so professional. I've never seen him do anything inappropriate. Jordan sighed, trying to keep his frustration in check. I understand how it sounds, he said, but Mia wouldn't make something like this up. She's scared, Stephanie. And if there's even a chance that what she's saying is true, don't you think we owe it to our kids to at least ask questions? Stephanie seemed to consider this, her expression softening. You're right, she said finally. I'll talk to Lily, see if she's noticed anything. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but you're right. We have to be sure. Word began to spread among the parents, and soon, Jordan was fielding calls and messages from people he barely knew. Some were supportive, sharing their own concerns about Mr. Whittaker's behavior, while others were defensive, accusing Jordan of overreacting and trying to ruin a man's career. It was exhausting, but Jordan didn't let it deter him. For every person who doubted him, there was another who quietly admitted they had noticed something off about Mr. Whittaker, but hadn't wanted to rock the boat. One evening, as Jordan was scrolling through his phone, he received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You're not alone." Intrigued, he opened it and found a message from someone claiming to be a former student of Mr. Whittaker's. The email was brief but chilling. The sender described similar experiences to Mia's, recounting moments of discomfort and unease that had ultimately led them to quit ballet altogether. They apologized for not coming forward sooner, explaining that they had been too scared to speak up at the time. Jordan's hands shook as he read the email. This was exactly the kind of evidence he needed to build a case, but it also made the reality of the situation even more heartbreaking. How many other students had been affected? How many had stayed silent out of fear or shame? He forwarded the email to his attorney, hoping it would strengthen their position. Meanwhile, Mia was starting to regain some of her confidence. With her father's unwavering support and the knowledge that she wasn't alone, she began to feel a little less scared. But the journey was far from over. The studio had launched its own investigation, though it quickly became clear to Jordan that it was more about damage control than finding the truth. They had yet to speak to Mia directly, and their communications were filled with vague assurances and carefully worded statements. As the weeks went on, Jordan found himself growing more frustrated. The studio was dragging its feet, and Mr. Whittaker was still teaching classes as though nothing had happened. It was infuriating, but Jordan refused to back down. He knew the legal process would take time, but he also knew it was the only way to hold the studio and Mr. Whittaker accountable. The turning point came when another parent came forward with their own story. This time, it wasn't an anonymous email, but a face-to-face conversation. The mother of a former student approached Jordan after school one day, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry for what Mia's going through," she said. "I've been carrying this for years, and I can't stay silent anymore." She explained that her daughter had quit ballet suddenly a few years ago, citing similar experiences to Mia's. At the time, the mother hadn't pressed her daughter for details, assuming it was just teenage rebellion or a loss of interest. But now, hearing Mia's story, she realized there was more to it. "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know," she said, her voice trembling. Jordan thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces were starting to come together, and he was more determined than ever to see this through. But as the fight continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something deeper and more sinister that had yet to come to light. The battle was far from over, and Jordan knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Jordan knew that the fight was bigger than just his family now. The more he delved into the layers of this situation, the more it became clear that something deeply systemic was at play. He couldn't ignore the quiet whispers from other parents, or the fact that the studio seemed more focused on protecting its image than addressing the heart of the matter. It felt like he was swimming against a strong tide, but Jordan had never been the type to back down from a challenge, especially when his daughter's safety and dignity were at stake. One evening, as Jordan sat in his home office reviewing his growing stack of notes and emails, the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief moment, his stomach twisted with unease. Peeking through the window, he saw Stephanie standing on his porch, clutching a folder. Her expression was tense, and Jordan could tell this wasn't a social visit. He opened the door and invited her inside. "I found something," Stephanie said, her voice low as though someone might be listening. She placed the folder on the table and slid it toward him. "It's about Mr. Whitaker. I was doing some digging because, honestly, I couldn't sleep knowing Lily might have been in harm's way. And well, I found this." Jordan opened the folder, his eyes scanning over the documents inside. They appeared to be news clippings and legal records from years ago in another state. At first, the pieces didn't fully connect, but as he read further, his chest tightened. The name might have been slightly different, perhaps a middle name or a shortened version, but the details of the case bore an eerie resemblance to what Mia and the anonymous emails had described. "Is this real?" Jordan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Stephanie nodded. "I triple-checked. He was accused of something similar at another studio, but it never went to trial. The case was dropped, and he moved here a year later. It's like he's been able to just start over." Jordan's grip tightened on the papers. This wasn't just negligence on the studio's part. This was willful ignorance. Had they known about his past and hired him anyway? Or had they chosen not to dig too deeply, prioritizing convenience over safety? Either way, it was unacceptable. This wasn't just about Mr. Whitaker anymore. It was about a system that allowed people like him to slip through the cracks and continue to harm others. The next day, Jordan contacted his attorney with the new information. He also began reaching out to the parents who had expressed concerns, organizing a meeting at his home to discuss their next steps. It was a difficult conversation, filled with tears, anger, and moments of doubt. Some parents were still hesitant, worried about the potential backlash or the impact on their children's love for dance. But others, like Stephanie, were ready to stand with Jordan and demand accountability. Meanwhile, Mia was doing her best to navigate her emotions. She had started seeing a counselor, which helped her process what had happened and begin to rebuild her confidence. But there were still moments when she felt overwhelmed, like when she overheard kids at school whispering about her, or when she saw an ad for an upcoming recital and was reminded of the studio she once loved. Jordan did his best to support her, always reminding her that none of this was her fault and that she was incredibly brave for speaking up. As the weeks went on, the story began to gain traction. One of the parents, a journalist, suggested taking the issue to the media. At first, Jordan hesitated. He worried about exposing Mia to more scrutiny or turning their fight into a spectacle. But after some thought, he realized that shining a light on this issue might be the only way to ensure real change. With Mia's blessing, he agreed to share their story, careful to protect her identity as much as possible. The media coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought much-needed attention to the issue, prompting more parents and former students to come forward with their own stories. On the other hand, it also brought criticism and skepticism from those who refused to believe that someone as respected as Mr. Whitaker could be capable of such things. The studio released a statement, calling the allegations deeply troubling, but urging the public not to rush to judgment. It was a hollow gesture, one that only fueled Jordan's determination to hold them accountable. Behind the scenes, the studio's leadership was scrambling. Karen, the manager, called Jordan to request a meeting, claiming they wanted to find a resolution. Jordan agreed, but made it clear that he wouldn't be backing down. The meeting was tense, with Karen and the studio's legal team doing their best to deflect responsibility. They insisted they had no prior knowledge of Mr. Whitaker's past and that they were conducting a thorough investigation. But when Jordan presented the documents Stephanie had uncovered, their composure faltered. "You knew," Jordan said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "Maybe not at first, but at some point you knew, and you chose to do nothing." Karen's face flushed, but she said nothing, her eyes darting toward the legal team, as though searching for guidance. It was clear they were in damage control mode, more concerned about protecting their reputation than addressing the harm that had been done. As the meeting ended, Jordan walked out feeling both vindicated and frustrated. He had forced them to confront the truth, but it was only a small victory in the larger battle. He knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still legal hurdles to clear, not to mention the emotional toll it was taking on Mia and the other families involved. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone in this fight, and together, they were starting to make their voices heard. In the weeks that followed, Jordan continued to push forward. The parents who had joined him began organizing protests outside the studio, demanding accountability and transparency. Social media campaigns sprang up, amplifying their message and calling for stricter oversight in dance studios nationwide. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear: they were no longer powerless. Their fight had become a movement, one that was shining a light on a system that had failed too many for too long. Through it all, Jordan stayed focused on one goal: justice, not just for Mia, but for every child who had been let down by the adults who were supposed to protect them. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but he carried it gladly, knowing that this was a fight worth fighting. The protests outside the studio grew louder with each passing day. What began as a small gathering of concerned parents had transformed into a full-blown community outcry. People from all walks of life started showing up, holding signs demanding justice and accountability. News vans lined the street, reporters capturing every moment, while social media buzzed with hashtags that were now trending nationwide. The pressure was mounting, and Jordan knew they were getting closer to uncovering the full truth. Meanwhile, the studio seemed to be in chaos. Rumors circulated about Karen stepping down, and there were whispers of other instructors considering leaving to distance themselves from the controversy. Mr. Whitaker, however, remained conspicuously absent. He had yet to make a public statement, and according to a few sources, he hadn't been seen at the studio in weeks. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving the studio to deal with the fallout on its own. Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden, something bigger than even the documents Stephanie had uncovered. He decided to dig deeper, enlisting the help of a private investigator. The investigator, a retired detective named Marcus, had a reputation for getting results, and Jordan felt a sense of relief knowing someone with experience was on his side. Marcus assured him that no stone would be left unturned. In the meantime, Mia's strength became an anchor for everyone involved. Though she was still working through her own fears, she began speaking out, first in small, private meetings with other kids and parents, and eventually in a recorded interview that was shared anonymously online. Her voice was steady yet emotional as she described her experiences, and her words resonated with countless others. Messages of support flooded in, from strangers who had never met her to other young dancers who shared similar stories of their own. Jordan watched the video with tears in his eyes, both proud and heartbroken. He saw the weight she carried, but also the courage she showed in speaking up. It was a reminder of why he couldn't give up, no matter how daunting the fight became. The stakes were higher than ever, not just for Mia, but for every child who had been hurt or silenced. Then, late one night, Marcus called with an update. "Jordan," he began, his voice serious, "you were right. There's more to this than we thought." Jordan's heart raced as he listened. Marcus had uncovered a series of transactions between the studio and a legal firm known for handling settlements in hush-hush cases. The pattern suggested that the studio might have been paying off families to keep quiet about past incidents involving Mr. Whittaker. It was a shocking revelation, but it also explained why he had been able to continue teaching despite his history. The studio had been protecting him to protect itself. "Do we have proof?" Jordan asked, barely able to contain his anger. "We're getting close," Marcus replied. "I'm following up on a lead that could tie everything together, but I need more time." Time was something Jordan wasn't sure they had. The studio's legal team was already trying to discredit him and the other parents, framing their protests as a baseless witch hunt. And while the court date for their case was approaching, he knew the studio would use every trick in the book to delay or derail the proceedings. As the days turned into weeks, tensions reached a boiling point. A leaked email from a former studio employee hinted at a cover-up, adding fuel to the fire. Protesters grew more vocal, demanding that Mr. Whittaker and the studio face consequences. But with each new development, the opposition also grew stronger. Anonymous accounts online began posting messages in defense of the studio, accusing Jordan and the other parents of overreacting and spreading false information. The battle was no longer just about the facts. It had become a fight for public opinion. Jordan tried to shield Mia from the worst of it, but even she couldn't escape the whispers and stares at school. One afternoon, she came home in tears after overhearing a classmate's parent call her a liar. Jordan held her close, reminding her that the truth was on their side, even if it didn't feel like it in the moment. He promised her that they would see this through, no matter how hard it got. Then, just as it seemed the tension couldn't get any higher, Marcus called again. This time, he sounded breathless, almost excited. "Jordan, I've got it," he said. "The smoking gun." Marcus had obtained a copy of a settlement agreement between the studio and a family from years ago. The document included a non-disclosure clause, preventing the family from speaking out about their experience. But what stood out most was the signature at the bottom, Mr. Whittaker's name, alongside Karen's. It was undeniable proof that the studio had known about his behavior and had chosen to cover it up. Jordan's hands shook as he held the document, the weight of its implications settling over him. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, but it also meant the stakes were higher than ever. The studio would fight tooth and nail to keep this from coming to light, and the legal battle ahead would be brutal. He shared the discovery with the other parents, and together, they decided to take the next step, going public. They held a press conference, presenting the evidence and demanding justice, not just for their own children, but for anyone who had been affected by the studio's actions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Media outlets picked up the story, and public opinion began to shift in their favor. But with the spotlight came new challenges, including threats and intimidation from those who wanted to silence them. Jordan knew they were nearing the climax of their fight. The court date was just around the corner, and the tension was almost unbearable. Every day felt like a battle, but they were finally gaining momentum. As he looked at Mia, who had grown stronger and more confident through it all, he reminded himself why they had started this fight in the first place. They were fighting for her future, for her dreams, and for her right to be heard. But even as they prepared for the courtroom showdown, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that the studio had one last trick up its sleeve. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. And yet, he knew there was no turning back now. The fight for justice had become bigger than any of them, and they were ready to see it through to the end. Just as Jordan and the parents felt a glimmer of hope with the newfound evidence, an unexpected twist sent shockwaves through their progress. It started with a cryptic message sent to Jordan's phone late one evening. The sender was anonymous, and the message read, "You're not fighting the whole truth. Be careful who you trust." Attached was a blurred photo that appeared to show Marcus, the investigator, shaking hands with a man who looked suspiciously like one of the studio's legal representatives. Jordan's stomach dropped. Was it possible that Marcus had been compromised? Or was this some elaborate attempt by the studio to sow doubt and confusion? Jordan tried to brush it off as a scare tactic, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Marcus had scheduled a follow-up meeting the next morning to discuss the case, and Jordan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. When Marcus arrived, he seemed upbeat, carrying a folder with what he claimed was more damning evidence. But as Jordan listened to him speak, he began to notice inconsistencies in his story, details that didn't quite match up with what Marcus had told him before. Jordan's mind raced, torn between confronting Marcus and playing along to gather more information. Meanwhile, the studio made its next move. A slickly produced video was released on social media, featuring Karen and other instructors painting a picture of the studio as a victim of baseless allegations. They spoke about the positive impact they'd had on countless children over the years, emphasizing their commitment to the arts and the community. Karen's voice trembled as she claimed they were being targeted unfairly, her words carefully chosen to evoke sympathy. To Jordan's frustration, the video went viral, with many in the comments defending the studio and accusing the parents of overreacting. But what truly escalated the conflict was the revelation that another parent had come forward, this time with allegations that not only implicated Mr. Whitaker, but also suggested a larger network of enablers within the studio. The parent, a mother named Linda, claimed that when her daughter had raised concerns about inappropriate behavior years ago, Karen herself had dismissed it, urging them to keep quiet to avoid disrupting the studio's reputation. Linda had been hesitant to come forward until she saw Mia's courage, but now she was determined to support the fight for justice. Linda's story added a new layer of complexity to the case. It wasn't just about Mr. Whitaker anymore. It was about a culture of silence and complicity that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. The parents rallied around Linda, grateful for her bravery, but the added weight of her story also made the stakes feel even higher. If they lost the case, it wouldn't just be a personal defeat. It would send a message that institutions like the studio could continue to shield predators without consequence. The tension between Jordan and Marcus reached a breaking point when Jordan decided to confront him directly. He showed Marcus the blurry photo and demanded an explanation. Marcus's reaction was one of genuine shock, and he vehemently denied any wrongdoing. He insisted that the man in the photo wasn't him, and that this was likely a tactic by the studio to discredit him and derail their efforts. Jordan wanted to believe him, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. With so much at stake, he couldn't afford to take any chances. As the court date loomed closer, the parents found themselves facing an increasingly aggressive counterattack from the studio. Anonymous letters were sent to some of the parents' homes, containing veiled threats and insinuations about their personal lives. Social media accounts linked to the studio began spreading misinformation, claiming that the parents had financial motives and were seeking to extort money through the lawsuit. Jordan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, knowing that every step forward seemed to bring another hurdle. Then came the second twist. An unexpected ally stepped into the fray. A former employee of the studio, a receptionist named Emily, reached out to Jordan with a bombshell revelation. She had worked at the studio for several years and had witnessed firsthand the shady practices that had kept Mr. Whitaker's behavior under wraps. Emily claimed that she had been pressured to shred documents, delete emails, and keep quiet about conversations she had overheard between Karen and the legal team. She was willing to testify, but there was a catch. Emily had signed a non-disclosure agreement when she left the studio, and breaking it could have serious legal and financial consequences for her. Jordan felt torn. Emily's testimony could be the key to winning the case, but asking her to take such a risk felt unfair. He and the other parents decided to consult their legal team, who assured them that they could argue the NDA was invalid if it was used to cover up illegal activities. Emily agreed to move forward, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination as she recounted what she had seen. Her courage reignited the parents' resolve, but it also put a target on her back. Within days, Emily reported receiving threatening messages and seeing unfamiliar cars parked outside her home. As the days counted down to the court date, the pressure became almost unbearable. Jordan barely slept, his mind racing with worry for Mia, for Emily, and for everyone who had put their trust in him to lead this fight. The studio's legal team was rumored to be preparing a last-minute motion to dismiss the case, and Jordan knew they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension was reaching a breaking point. But through it all, Jordan kept reminding himself of why they were fighting. He thought of Mia's bravery, of Linda's determination, of Emily's willingness to risk everything to tell the truth. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for accountability, for change, for a future where no child would have to endure what Mia and so many others had. And as the court date finally arrived, Jordan felt a mix of fear and hope, knowing that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The day of the trial arrived with an air of nervous anticipation. The courtroom buzzed with energy as reporters, supporters, and skeptics alike filled the seats. Jordan sat next to Mia, holding her hand for reassurance. Emily sat nearby, her face pale but resolute, while Linda and a handful of other parents who had come forward sat together, their expressions a mixture of anger and hope. Across the aisle sat Karen and Mr. Whittaker, flanked by an intimidating team of lawyers, their faces carefully composed to hide any cracks in their confidence. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side laying out their version of the story. Jordan's legal team emphasized the bravery of the children who had come forward, the systemic failures that allowed the behavior to persist, and the strength of the evidence they had gathered. The studio's lawyers, in contrast, painted the accusations as baseless, claiming the parents were motivated by personal vendettas and financial greed. The back and forth was intense, and as the first witnesses were called, the tension in the room grew thick. Mia was the first to take the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she walked up, her small frame looking even smaller under the harsh glare of the lights. Jordan's heart pounded as he watched her sit down, clutching the edge of her seat. She glanced at him briefly, and he gave her a small, encouraging nod. With a deep breath, Mia began to speak, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. She recounted the incidents with Mr. Whittaker in vivid detail, her words painting a picture of the subtle yet insidious nature of his behavior. When it came time for cross-examination, the studio's lawyers tried to rattle her, questioning her memory and suggesting that she might have misunderstood his actions. But Mia held her ground, her calm demeanor and unwavering testimony making it clear that she was telling the truth. Jordan felt a swell of pride and a pang of sadness all at once. Pride in her courage and sadness that she had been forced to display it in the first place. Next came Emily, whose testimony shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom entirely. She spoke about the pressure she had faced to destroy evidence, the conversations she had overheard, and the lengths the studio had gone to in order to protect Mr. Whittaker. She produced documents she had secretly saved as proof, their contents sending murmurs rippling through the room. The studio's lawyers tried to discredit her, bringing up her NDA and insinuating that she was bitter about her departure from the studio. But Emily's resolve didn't waver. "I couldn't stay silent any longer," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "What I saw was wrong, and these kids deserve justice." As the trial progressed, the momentum seemed to shift in favor of Jordan and the other parents. Linda's testimony further exposed the studio's culture of silence, and expert witnesses bolstered their case by explaining how grooming behaviors often go unnoticed until it's too late. The studio's lawyers, however, didn't back down. They called Karen to the stand, where she tearfully denied any knowledge of wrongdoing and insisted that the studio had always prioritized the safety of its students. Her performance was convincing enough to plant seeds of doubt in some of the onlookers, but Jordan knew the truth, and he hoped the evidence would speak louder than her words. Just when it seemed the trial couldn't get any more dramatic, the unexpected twist came. During the cross-examination of one of the studio's witnesses, Jordan's lawyer produced a video recording that hadn't been disclosed earlier. The footage, which had been anonymously sent to the legal team the night before, showed a private meeting between Karen and Mr. Whittaker. In the video, Karen could be heard instructing him on how to handle the accusations and suggesting ways to deflect blame. The courtroom erupted in gasps as the recording played, Karen's carefully crafted image of innocence unraveling in an instant. Karen's face turned ashen as the video ended. She stammered out an explanation, claiming the recording was taken out of context, but the damage had been done. The studio's lawyers scrambled to recover, but it was clear that the tide had turned irrevocably. The judge called for a brief recess, during which whispers and speculation filled the room. Jordan sat quietly, his mind racing with disbelief and relief. He didn't know who had sent the video, but its existence felt like a small miracle, a beacon of truth in a sea of lies. When the trial resumed, it was clear that the studio's defense had been significantly weakened. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom stretching to its breaking point. Finally, they returned with a verdict. The judge's voice was steady as she read the decision. Mr. Whittaker was found guilty of misconduct, and the studio was deemed negligent for failing to protect its students. The room erupted into a mix of cheers and tears as the parents hugged one another, their months of struggle and sacrifice culminating in this moment of justice. But just as Jordan thought the ordeal was over, the final twist emerged. After the trial, he received another anonymous message. This time, it contained a simple note: "The fight isn't over. There are more like him." Attached was a list of other instructors and studios allegedly involved in similar cases, suggesting that what they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Jordan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the enormity of the challenge ahead. They had won this battle, but the war for accountability and systemic change was far from over. As Jordan and Mia walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and reporters, he held her hand tightly. He looked down at her and saw a spark of hope in her eyes, a reminder of why they had fought so hard. "We did it, Daddy," she said softly, and Jordan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced the impossible and come out stronger, but he knew their journey wasn't over. For now, though, they could celebrate this victory, knowing they had taken a stand for what was right and set an example for others to follow. The courthouse was nearly empty by the time Jordan and Mia stepped outside. The crowd that had been there earlier had thinned, leaving behind only a few reporters and curious onlookers. Jordan felt the weight of the day settle on him, a mix of exhaustion and relief washing over him. He crouched down to Mia's level and brushed a stray curl from her face. "You were so brave today," he said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Mia's lips curled into a small smile, but there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. "Is he going to jail, Daddy?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jordan nodded. "Yes, sweetie. He's going to face the consequences for what he did. And because of you and the other kids, he won't be able to hurt anyone else." Mia seemed to take comfort in that, leaning into her father's embrace. For a moment, they just stood there, holding each other, as if the world had disappeared around them. It was a small moment of peace amidst the chaos of everything they had been through. As the weeks passed, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least, a new version of normal. Mia returned to school and her favorite activities, though she decided to step away from ballet for the time being. Jordan respected her decision, understanding that she needed time to heal. Instead, they found new ways to spend their evenings: bike rides through the park, movie nights with popcorn, and baking cookies in the kitchen. It was their way of reclaiming the time that had been overshadowed by court dates and stress. Emily, the former receptionist, became a close family friend. She often stopped by for dinner, and Mia had taken to calling her Aunt Emily. It was clear that Emily had found a sense of purpose in speaking out, and she was working with advocacy groups to push for stronger protections for children in extracurricular activities. Her courage had inspired others to come forward, and she was determined to use her voice for change. Linda, the other parent who had been instrumental in the case, also became part of their extended circle. Together with Jordan, they formed a small coalition of parents dedicated to holding organizations accountable. They attended meetings, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly to ensure that what had happened to their children wouldn't happen to anyone else. It wasn't easy work, but it felt necessary. One evening, as Jordan was sorting through papers at the kitchen table, he came across the anonymous note he had received after the trial. "The fight isn't over. There are more like him." The words had haunted him ever since. He knew that their victory in court was just one battle in a much larger war. There were still systemic issues to address, and countless other children who might be vulnerable. Jordan wasn't sure who had sent the message, but it felt like a call to action, one he couldn't ignore. Jordan reached out to some of the advocacy groups Emily had connected with, sharing the list of names and studios that had been included in the anonymous tip. Together, they began to investigate, gathering evidence, and reaching out to families who might have been affected. It was difficult and often heartbreaking work, but it also felt meaningful. For the first time in a long time, Jordan felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement for justice and accountability. Mia, meanwhile, was finding her own way to heal. One afternoon, as Jordan was cleaning up the living room, he heard the faint sound of music coming from her room. Curious, he peeked in and saw her spinning in circles, her arms gracefully extended. She was dancing, not ballet, but something freer, more spontaneous. It was the first time he had seen her dance since everything had happened, and it brought tears to his eyes. She looked up and caught him watching, her face breaking into a shy smile. "I missed it," she admitted. Jordan smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "Then dance, baby girl. Dance as much as you want." The moment felt like a turning point, a sign that Mia was beginning to reclaim the parts of herself that had been overshadowed by trauma. It wasn't an overnight process. There were still days when she felt sad or anxious, and nights when she needed her dad to sit with her until she fell asleep. But slowly, step by step, she was moving forward. Months turned into a year, and the case became a landmark moment in their community. Policies were changed, awareness campaigns were launched, and more survivors felt empowered to come forward. Jordan and Mia's story was often cited as an example of the power of speaking out and standing up for what's right. One day, as Jordan was flipping through a photo album, he came across a picture of Mia in her first ballet recital. She was beaming, her tiny pink tutu a blur as she spun in the air. The image was bittersweet, a reminder of both what she had lost and how far she had come. He placed the album back on the shelf, a quiet resolve settling over him. They couldn't change the past, but they could shape the future. That evening, Jordan and Mia sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the colors blending together like a masterpiece. "Daddy," Mia said suddenly, her voice thoughtful, "do you think we helped people?" Jordan looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "I know we did," he said. "And I'm so proud of you for being brave enough to tell the truth. You're stronger than you know." Mia leaned against him, her small hand slipping into his. "I'm proud of you too," she said, "for fighting for me." In that moment, under the fading light of the sun, it felt like everything they had been through had led to this, a sense of peace, of closure, and of hope for the future. The journey hadn't been easy, and the scars would always be there. But they had faced the darkness together and come out stronger on the other side. As they sat there, Jordan thought about the anonymous note and the work still left to do. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as there were battles to fight and people to protect, he would keep going. For Mia, for the other children, for every family that deserved justice. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jordan felt a quiet determination settle over him, a promise to himself and to Mia that their story wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning.